In this video, we will examine a second alternative measure of the buyer's monetary damages in the event the seller breaches a contract by never tendering the goods that she was obligated to, market-based damages under 713 of Article 2. As we have said, where the seller breaches by failing to tender the goods, the buyer may recover cover damages pursuant to Section 712 of Article 2, where buyer enters into a substitute transaction to purchase substitute goods. Market-based damages under 713 apply only when and to the extent that the buyer does not cover. So market-based damages will only be available to the buyer if the buyer does not enter into a substitute contract with another seller for substitute goods. As we have noted, in the real world, buyers will typically have good reasons to pursue a cover transaction. But there may also be reasons why a buyer may elect not to cover. Perhaps the buyer cannot readily find substitute goods, or perhaps finding substitute goods is not worth the buyer's time or energy. A no-cover situation is especially likely to arise where the goods are not essential for the buyer. Whatever the case may be, where the seller breaches by failing to tender the goods and the buyer does not cover for those goods, the buyer is relegated to damages based on the market price of those goods under 713 of Article 2. Essentially, Section 713 treats the buyer as if she had entered into a cover transaction, a hypothetical cover transaction, at the market price for the goods, and awards the buyer damages accordingly. Specifically, in this scenario, the measure of the buyer's direct damages would be equal to the difference between the market price of substitute goods, that is the price the buyer would have paid if the buyer chose to cover, minus the cost of the goods under the breached contract, that is the price the buyer would have paid the breaching seller if the seller had delivered the goods. Note here the symmetry between the measure of cover damages under 712 and market-based damages under 713. That symmetry is not a coincidence, because both 712 and 713 are aiming at the same goal, to measure and compensate the buyer for the buyer's expectation interest. Stated differently, to measure the amount of damages necessary to give the buyer the benefit of the bargain under the contract that the seller has breached. The market-based formula for damages under 713 is fairly straightforward, but determining the correct market price can in some cases be difficult. Subsection 2 says that the relevant market price is generally the market price at the place of tender. So if the market price of the goods varies in different locations, if there are local markets for the relevant goods, then the relevant market price for determining 713 damages is the market price at the place of tender as required by the breached contract. In addition, subsection 1 says that the relevant time for determining the market price is the time when the buyer learned of the seller's breach. That can be sometimes difficult to pinpoint. For example, imagine the seller anticipatorily repudiates its contract with the buyer. Recall that under 610 of Article 2, upon a repudiation by the seller, the buyer has the right to wait a commercially reasonable period of time for performance by the seller instead of immediately resorting to the buyer's remedy for breach. So if the buyer waits before canceling the contract and resorting to remedies, should the time of breach be the moment of the seller's repudiation, or after some reasonable period of time while the buyer was awaiting the seller's performance? Note subsection 1 of 723 in Article 2 provides some guidance on this question, but that subsection applies only in the unlikely scenario where the court trial occurs before the time for performance was actually due under the contract. Other than that very narrow provision, the UCC is largely silent on this question, and there are conflicting judicial precedents on the issue. The upshot is that, though the basic rule laid out in 713 of Article 2 for computing market-based damages is relatively straightforward, in practice, determining the appropriate market price can present difficult evidentiary and statutory interpretation issues. With those complexities in mind, that concludes our look at buyer's market-based damages under 713, which are available to the buyer to the extent the buyer does not cover and recover damages pursuant to 712 of Article 2. In the next video, we will conclude this week's module by considering what additional indirect damages may be available to the buyer in the event the seller breaches by failing to tender the goods.